I've been dreaming for about a year of trying to get JD up here on this stage. You heard about his book, and Tom, thanks for yet another incredibly eloquent introduction of both of us. This, of course, a #1 bestseller for many, many months, almost as long as 50 Shades of Grey, I think. That's what they tell me. You heard about, one of the books to help you understand Trump's win. Best book of 2016 by another economist. You will not read a more important book this year. A book that has a title that really has become a metaphor for a truly significant development in our country, as we'll discuss. Soon to be a motion picture, as you heard, Ron Howard in the chair as the director. Translated into German, Spanish, and other languages. This has been quite a year that you've had. You spoke at the Sun Valley Billionaires Conference, The Weekend with Charlie Rose, KKR's annual gathering, and many more. And now, I did my research. I used to do intelligence. Now I understand online. There are books that actually summarize Hillbilly Elegy. I mean, this is not the thickest of books.
That's right.
When Ron Chernow is here, by the way, that's going to be a tremendous one. I mean, that book's about like this. But this has its own summary now. There's another one it interprets Hillbilly Elegy, and still another that gleans trivia from it. So this has been quite a run, and now, the crowning event, you have really arrived on the best stage in all of New York with an audience that represents the most important intellectual critical mass in a city. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Did you ever think it was going to be like this when you first wrote this, by the way?
No, not at all. The initial print run for Hillbilly Elegy was 10,000 copies, which I thought was low, but I didn't think that, it was too low, like maybe 15,000 would have been the right number. And I remember thinking to myself, when I was writing all these, really personal details in the book and really laying my heart out on these pages, the way that I consoled myself with it is that, well, nobody's going to read it, so it's okay. So it's definitely not something I expected, but, crazy things happen, obviously.
But you weren't afraid of sort of embarrassment. I mean, that it wouldn't fly off. Not only would it not fly off, it would just sit on the...
Well, I was probably more afraid of embarrassment than certainly expecting that the book would explode like it did. But the consolation of embarrassment that it didn't, that it wouldn't have sold especially well, is that, of course, all of these personal details would have remained largely hidden from public view. So I had built up this specter in my mind where the book only selling 1,000 copies wasn't that bad of a thing after all.
Rationalization is everything.
That's right.
So what's the book about? I mean, how would you describe it? What's the big picture here?
Sure. So there's a big picture and I think a small picture. And what I mean is that I try to do something that, hopefully I accomplished reasonably well. But I was trying to give a sense of a larger social phenomenon through the lens of my particular family history. And so the story starts in the 1940s in Eastern Kentucky, where my grandparents grew up in extreme poverty. It sort of follows them from Eastern Kentucky to southwestern Ohio, where they moved to find work in the steel mills. It sort of traces the problems that they had adapting to lower middle class, blue collar life. And then it sort of reveals that these problems that they encountered when they were really poor in the 1940s, a lot of the habits and attitudes and expectations that they developed continued to follow them, and I think continued to influence the way that their children grew up. And so by the time that I was born, a lot of the really, sort of the boom economy of the industrial Midwest had started to falter a little bit. It wasn't obvious to those of us who were growing up in it, but the writing was really on the wall. It was becoming pretty clear that competition from overseas and other economic factors were making it really hard to depend on that blue-collar union job. And consequently, the community around me started to really struggle, and of course my family especially started to really struggle. And so I talk a lot about the problems that my mom had, the problems that we had finding a stable father, husband type figure to really provide some rootedness to the family. I talk about the struggles that we had, not just my mom, but generations back with addiction, which manifests itself in different ways. In the 1950s, it was alcohol. In the 1990s, it was opioids. And of course, opioids is a really big social crisis these days. But I really try to give people a sense of what it's like when your community, your neighborhood, really your entire culture as you understand it, is falling apart and not doing especially well. And I wrote it in the way that I did because I thought that a lot of folks had written the hyper-abstract, very intellectual, and frankly, the people who had written those things were smarter than I was, about trying to understand what's really going on in these local regional economies. Why don't we have as much upward mobility in southwestern Ohio as we might like to have? What's really driving the social disintegration, the decline of social capital, and so forth? So I thought there was a pretty good, rich background source material to understand these things from 30,000 feet. But what I did think was really missing was this dissection of these problems at a very personal level. I do think it's easy to come to somebody, I think you can be a radical right-winger or a radical left-winger and come to the work of somebody like Raj Chetty or Robert Putnam and basically fit their work into your ideological box. I saw people doing that. I felt like, having engaged with those writers a lot, I was worried a little bit that when people read them, they just allowed themselves to have their own biases confirmed. And I wanted to try to write something really personal because I wanted to sort of hit people in the face and say, these people are a lot more complex and these problems are a lot more difficult than you might like to think. So let's talk about that real complexity. And the only way that I knew how to do that was to write this very intense personal story.
And you bare your soul. For those of you who haven't read this is an enthralling book. Look, there's lots of books out there that are all about, from the Barrio to Harvard or whatever, all these different kinds of things.
Sure.
And they're all wonderful personal stories. But this one really grabs you, and you just bear it all. And was it painful at times because by the time you're writing this, and we'll go back and we'll start back at the beginning here in a second, but you're writing this, you're already a graduate of Yale Law School, you got this nifty firm that you're working for out in Silicon Valley, you've got a wife, you got a dog, there's a child on the way.
Sure.
It's the American dream, and all of a sudden you're going to go back and sort of pull the scab off and revisit all the stuff that you endured, which had to be just excruciating.
Yeah, it was definitely painful in certain ways, and there were times when I wrote the book where I was probably a pretty miserable person to be around. I do think that my wife has sort of the patience of a saint, because it's definitely the case that when you think about these things, you try to understand and contextualize them, and you most of all just relive some of these memories that you end up sometimes worse for the wear. You end up a little emotionally invested in what you write about. And yeah, you're right. You do pull off the scab, and I think that definitely takes its toll on you. The flip side of that, and the positive spin that I would put on it, is that it can be cathartic in a certain way. I was one of these people. I wrote in the book that when I was in law school, I tried to go and talk to a counselor, and I'm generally a pretty big fan of folks going and trying to deal with some of these things through the medium of talking to a mental health specialist. But that was always just a little bit too difficult for me. And this book, in some ways, was this long counseling effort for myself. It forced me to really try to understand what was going on in my family's history. I always wondered, why are we like this? Why are these things happening? Why is it that so many of the people who grew up like us are not doing well in the modern world? And most of all, why are there such intense, personal, traumatic moments that animate my sister and I's childhood? And understanding that and understanding where it came from was ultimately, I think, a very good thing for me. So while it was painful at times, it was definitely worthwhile. The other thing I'd say is that it really helped me understand these problems in a broader context. I think when I started to write the book, I probably looked at my mom as a bit of a villain. I was very angry. I was very resentful at her. And by the time I was done writing the book, I really gained an appreciation for what made her tick, for how she came to some of these problems and some of these issues. And it gave me, frankly, a lot more sympathy and a lot more understanding for a person that I think I really needed to have that moment of reckoning with.
Well, let's go back then to the beginning. This is really a story that begins with immigrants from the Scots, the Irish, I guess,
Sure.
and the Northern English.
Sure.
and they come to a certain part of the country and
Yeah, that's right. They come to, there are all of these theories that I didn't really get into in the book for why the people of Appalachia and, a disproportionate share of them were
it's
Scots-Irish.
Appalachia, by the way, not Appalachia, as we might say it.
A disproportionate share of them were Scots-Irish. Certainly not all of them were Scots-Irish. And people talk about why were they attracted to these mountains, right? So some people argue that it reminded them of the Scottish Highlands from back home. And so they were just attracted to these upland lifestyles because that's where they came from, and they sort of preferred this isolated, rugged lifestyle. I didn't really get into that because I didn't think that was sort of what I needed to understand. But what is certainly the case is that these people found themselves living in areas of the country that were really heavily dependent on subsistence farming and on classically understood extraction industries. So before the coal industry, there was the timber industry. Before the timber industry, there were just a lot of people living on family homesteads and trying to make a living for themselves. And consequently, there was this intense poverty that animated the family story of a lot of these folks. And so the thing that the thing that struck to me when I really started to think about my family history is this way in which my grandparents especially had internalized this idea that they were poor people. Not that they had been poor, not that they had lived in poverty themselves, but that they were from a group of people who were poor people. And that was just really important in the way that they understood themselves and they understood their place in the world. And like you said, they really were immigrants. I mean, when they moved north, they found themselves in a much different environment and sometimes, thrown together with different groups of people. And so, one of the really interesting bits of research I found is that a lot of folks didn't stop in southwestern Ohio. They kept on moving north. And there was this massive migration both from the hills and from the deep south that ended up converging on Detroit. And there were all of these really interesting racial tensions in Detroit because this book that I found said that to the middle class Detroit folks, the hillbillies as they called them, and obviously as I titled the book, the hillbillies, they looked like they belonged, meaning they looked like they belonged to sort of the classic middle-class white Detroit lifestyle, but they didn't act like they belonged. And that sort of weird misalignment really affected how people were perceived. It created weird racial divisions. Middletown was a little bit different because it was a primarily white city as opposed to Detroit, which was a little bit more diverse. But the same basic things were cropping up. I mean, these people, and some of them are of course my family, they find themselves in these environments. The people who are there look down on them. They see them as backwards, as Southern. They don't like the way they talk. They don't like the way they act. And there was this remarkable cultural difference that persisted even when I was in middle school. I remember in grade school and middle school where people would say, oh, your family's from Kentucky, you're just a hilljack. Or your family's from this part of the country, do your relatives still have their teeth? There really was this remarkable cultural alienation that still accompanied that migration, even though most of the people I grew up with were 2 or 3 generations removed from it. Now, I was obviously a little bit closer because I grew up with my grandparents and we kept on going back to Eastern Kentucky. But that alienation, that cultural misalignment was really significant.
So what is a hillbilly, first? And then second, tell us about your grandparents, because they end up playing this incredibly prominent role, especially your grandmother,
Sure.
Mama, as I call her name.
Yeah, so the cautionary note I'd sound on what is a hillbilly is that I think that if you asked 100 different people with a life or a story different or similar to mine, you'd probably come up with 100 different answers. The way that I always define the term is that you had to have some deep connection to the Appalachian Mountains. Now, that manifested itself in different ways. For me, it was the place that we went to all the time when I was a kid growing up with my grandparents. And for some people, it was just the family homeland that maybe they hadn't visited in 5 or 10 years, but it was this mythical place that people thought of as, this is where we're from, this is where we came from, this is the place that animates us. So I think some connection to the land, to the mountains is really important. What's interesting, of course, is that the term hillbilly describes not just, or has been used to describe not just people with connections to the Appalachians, so West Virginia, Eastern Tennessee, Eastern Kentucky, and so forth. But it's also used to describe people from the Ozarks in Missouri.
Yeah.
And so that there is this weird kind of sense where the term applies to people who are American Highlanders in some significant way, and that's how I always define the term. And you know, my grandparents were, like you said, I think they're the most important characters in the book, the most important influences on my life.
Second of the Marine Corps, please.
And yeah.
That's coming. That's coming.
Yeah. But you know, my grandma especially was, you know, didn't have a high school education, didn't have anything in the way of opportunity, but was just unbelievably whip smart. You know, she was this, you know, she would always, and we hated her for it, she would make us play her in all these different card games, especially gin rummy. She loved to play gin rummy. And then she'd always beat us, and then she'd taunt us and say, you know, I'd be a 7-year-old kid just lost to my grandma in gin rummy, and she'd say, you were the worst effing card player that I have ever seen. And
A bit profane, was she?
Oh yeah, she was definitely a bit profane. She loved the F word, and she loved handguns, and she had a lot of those in her house. But she also, I think, she was perceptive in that she recognized, at least by the time that I was a kid, that there were these really powerful environmental factors that were starting to make it hard for me to have much in the way of opportunity. Mm-hmm. So she saw the way, I think, in which the community was becoming a little bit hopeless, a little bit detached. She saw the way in which folks in the broader neighborhood were maybe, you know, not on the pathway towards education and work opportunities. They were on the pathway to something a lot worse. And she always paired this remarkable sort of working class sensibility. You know, she hated rich people. She thought that, you know, she sort of viewed America in classic class conflict terms. It was the rich people against the working people, and she was on the side of working people. But at the same time, she never let me give in to this sense that I didn't have much in the way of choice or opportunity. She'd always say, look, JD, life's not fair for us, but don't ever be like those effing losers who think the deck is stacked against them. And she paired that in a way that gave me certainly, I think, a working class sensibility of myself, but also made it really hard for me to give up on myself. She really encouraged a certain amount of resilience, and that was incredibly powerful and something I really needed.
And she's married to an individual who's an alcoholic.
Yeah.
And I love the one story about how she says, if you ever come home drunk again, I'm going to kill you. And
yeah. And he came home drunk again, and he passed out on the couch, and she poured, depending on who you ask, gasoline or lighter fluid on him and lit a match and dropped it right on his chest. And of course, he didn't suffer, or luckily, I shouldn't say of course, luckily he didn't suffer any major health consequences, because my aunt, who was just a 12-year-old girl at the time, leapt into action and put out the fire on her own father. But Mamaw was not one of these people to sort of take this lying down. And I think that, you know, I obviously have a lot of sympathy for folks who come from domestic violence or households with domestic violence, because it existed in my family, and I certainly saw some of it growing up. But I do think that Mamaw fought fire literally with fire sometimes, right? And so, you know, my mom and my aunt have described this sort of constant psychological warfare. So if he came home drunk, you know, sometimes that one time she tried to kill him, but like one time she would cut his wallet out of his pants and hid it, so he didn't know where his wallet was. Or he'd come home drunk and he'd demand a fresh dinner, and she'd go and pour a bunch of garbage very, very carefully on the plate, heat it up in the microwave, and then serve it to him. And so she really, I think in some ways, she really took the domestic violence that existed in the household and in some cases even escalated it, which of course made their family life that more combustible and that more traumatic. But I also think it goes back to Mamaw's fundamental resilience and why she was ultimately this person who was able to survive and even thrive in a pretty tough circumstance.
And really is the one who saves your life, I think, at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. You know, when I didn't have a stable home to live in.
Yeah, let's talk about your mother and father.
Sure. Yeah, so mom struggled with addiction. My dad had sort of disappeared from my life for a very long time, but by the time I was 12 or 13, he re-entered my life. And you know, luckily I have a good relationship with both of them now, But I had been in this period for 14 or 15 years where we're moving houses at least once a year, so we feel very unstable. Like I said, there's a lot of drug use. There's a lot of different guys coming in and out of the house.
You said you had how many different fathers during your life?
Probably 15 or so stepdads if you count boyfriends along with husbands. And, you can look at the data, but I try to describe it very personally in the book. We know that the kids who grow up in those circumstances, they really struggle with it. They struggle with attaching to father figures. They struggle with trusting adult figures. And that instability really takes its toll. And so by the time I was 14 or 15, really struggling in school. I was getting nearly failing grades in high school. I was starting to experiment with drugs, starting to hang out with the kids that parents and grandparents don't want their kids to hang out with. And that was the point at which Mamaw stepped in and said, this is going to change. We're going to change the way that we do things. And where I had, always growing up, spent a lot of time in Mamaw's house. Sometimes it was for a week or two at a time. Sometimes it was a few days here and then a few days with Mom or with somebody else. Mamaw said, you're going to live here with me. You're not going to move anymore. And that's it. And she was the sort of person who, because she occasionally set her enemies on fire, when she said, you're going to live with me and that's it, I listened back.
Your mother's a truly tragic figure because first of all, she gets married and pregnant very early in life.
Sure.
Moves away, but ultimately gets through nursing school.
Yeah.
And has a decent job.
Sure. Yeah, I remember when I was a kid, probably 6 or 7, when she was going through nursing school, Mom would like to practice drawing blood on me, and I thought it was really cool. So I was a very willing volunteer, and I like to think, but that experience gave me this sense that I was sort of participating in helping Mom get through nursing school. And so I was really proud of her when she finished. I was really proud of her when she got her first job in the field. And it was a big moment for the family because, like you said, if you had looked at Mom when she was 19, she had a baby, she had a failed marriage already, you would have said, this is not a person who's going to be able to go back to school and really make something of themselves. But she did. But at the same time, as I write in the book, a lot of the demons, a lot of the things that happened when Mom was a kid, I think continued to chase her around. And she never quite figured out, I think, at least not until I was well into adulthood, she never quite figured out, I think, how to find real peace with herself, because as good as my grandparents were to me, and they really were the saviors in my life, they were, because of the fire incident, because of my grandfather's alcoholism, because of a lot of reasons, it was a pretty traumatic and unstable situation for my mom and my aunt. And consequently, it took Mom a really long time to deal with some of the problems of her own childhood. And because of that, I don't think she was ever able to really provide the stable home that we needed. And I think that in some ways is the great tragedy of these issues, is that they're not isolated. It's not just you face an alcoholic father or an abusive home, and it's really miserable, but then it's over and you recover. We know now that this has a really long-term effect on people, that they end up struggling with it sometimes for their entire lives, and then they end up passing it on to their children, and so it becomes this multi-generational feedback cycle. That's, of course, one of the main themes underlying the entire book. But yeah, it was tough, and I do think that Mom tried really hard. In a lot of ways, she was a very good mother, but in a lot of ways, she was just never able to quite escape the demons of her own childhood. And consequently, we saw some of the things, same things growing up in her household that she saw growing up in her own.
I mean, some of these episodes you describe are truly traumatic.
Sure.
She sort of kidnaps you. I mean, there's different moments along the way here, and obviously more and more serious addiction. It almost sounds somewhat doable as you're describing it here, but I have to say, reading it, it was, again, there's a lot of wincing as you do read it.
Sure. Yeah, well, yeah, imagine living through it.
Imagine writing it, imagine living it,
yeah. No, it's absolutely right that there were some really tough circumstances, right? And so, one of the things I talk about is the only time that the legal system ever intervened is when I went with Mom after I don't even remember what happened, but something had happened a couple days earlier. I had been staying with Mama, and I just remember that I was dead set against going back and living with Mom, that I was going to stay with Mama. And I was 12 years old at the time. And eventually I went on a car ride with Mom, and it led to this really, really intense outburst where Mom sped up the car and was saying, "I'm going to crash this car and kill us both. I'm going to crash this car and kill us both." And so eventually, I hopped in the back seat. I still don't know why I hopped in the back seat, just being a 12-year-old kid, but that's what I did. And then she pulled over the car, and I took a run for it. And I eventually found myself at this woman's house who called the police. And so that was the first and really the only time that the legal system actually intervened in our family. Most of this stuff was off the grid. But yeah, that was really tough. And obviously, it's the sort of thing that makes me worry that, or at least made me worry, that in the same way that I don't think Mom ever quite dealt with some of the things that she saw growing up, there was this moment of realization that I had when I was in law school that those sorts of things leave their mark too, and I've got to deal with those things. If you want to end that cycle, if you want to break that cycle, I think in some ways, even though it is, cringeworthy in some cases to think about it, to write about it, to read about it, that's the only way to actually deal with it and to find some way to break the cycle.
Tell us about your sister briefly, because she's also experiencing her own challenges.
Yeah, she's also experiencing her own challenges, and so she's 5 years older than me, and so yeah, I think that our lives must have been much different because she saw things through the prism. All of these things that I was, when I was 12 years old, she was 17. When I was 6, and a lot of the stuff that happened when I was 6 years old, I don't remember. She was 12. And I do think that a lot of what happened to us when we were kids, Lindsay had a much more mature outlook, but consequently also had a much more intense memory of a lot of those things. And I can proudly sit here and say that both of us are doing well, that each of us had our own sense of what it meant to do better than had been done to us. We each had this really strong sense of what we wanted was to get out of the house and to give our family something that we hadn't had, which was basic stability and comfort. And both of us have done that, but both of us have taken certainly different paths. And so, Lindsay has 3 kids now, 18, 16, and 15, maybe 18, 16, and 14. I apologize if my nieces and nephews are watching. I can't quite remember their ages. So I do remember their names.
We won't test you.
Yeah. Cam, Megan, Emma, I'm sorry. But I do think that she has, in some ways, a much more intense memory of some of the things that happened when we were kids.
Yep.
And I wonder in the same way that I wonder for myself. I hope that Lindsay finds and has found a way to figure these things out. Even between the two of us, it's something we don't like to talk about. I think that a lot of good things have come from the book, obviously. I've been blessed in a lot of ways because of the publication of Hillbilly Elegy, but it's also led to some really good and necessary conversations between me and my sister. Mm-hmm. And I do think that's part of the process of healing and thinking through these issues, and like I said, making sure that the cycle stops with you.
So before going to Mama Saves You, and then the Marine Corps really is a transformative experience. Where's your mother now, and how is she doing?
She's doing well. She lives in Middletown, which is where most of my family lives. Most of the rest live in eastern Kentucky. But she's doing really well. I mean, I think that, I was joking with Mom not long ago, and she said something to the effect of, I think I figured out my problem. It was having you guys to take care of, and so now that you guys are out of the house, it's a lot easier for me to manage. She, of course, was joking about that. But no, I think that Mom, I haven't asked her this sort of how question, because I think she's doing as well as I've ever seen her do, and of course I'm proud of her, and most of all, I'm just happy that she's doing really well. But I've never asked her how. What was it that's allowed you to get to this point where you feel a little bit more stable and a little bit more comfortable? But she's drug-free. She's been drug-free for a few years, and one of the big lessons I take away from Mom and I do a lot of work, on the opioid issue right now in Ohio, is that people fall off the wagon 5, 6 times, and it's sometimes the 7th time where they really stay clean and they stay sober and they're able to reintegrate into their families. And I think that's inspiring in certain ways, because you see people who themselves have gone back, who have relapsed into addiction 3rd, 4th time, and they just assume it will never get better. And I try to remind them that it does get better. People eventually do figure out a way to manage this stuff. The last thing I say about Mom is that, obviously a very complicated relationship in a lot of ways, given some of the stuff that's happened. But I have a 4-month-old baby at home, and it's been really good for Mom, and I think it's been really good for me, the way that and I may get a little emotional just talking about this, but the way that baby, I think, has provided a foundation for us to really re-engage with each other in a really intense way, because I see that she loves that baby like any grandmother should love a baby. And I think it's really important for me to see that. Again, going back to some of the resentment versus sympathy,
Sure.
It's good for me to see that Mom, fundamentally, I think, is a person who is dedicated and loyal to her family despite some of the mistakes she's made.
So back to, there you are in high school, you're starting to veer out from between the right and left limits, as they say.
Yeah.
And Mama takes charge, gets you through, and how does that go? And then you're in the Marine Corps.
Sure. Yeah, well, living with Mamaw for 3 years was a very interesting experience. I think I probably could have written a book just about those 3 years, because she was not a sit at home and knit you a sweater type of grandmother. When Mamaw died, we found 19 handguns in her house. They were all loaded, and not a single one of them was on the safety. And we realized, we sort of figured it out, that she was pretty immobile by the end of her life. She used a walker to get around, and even then it was pretty tough for her. But what we figured out is that she had stashed guns at strategic locations of the household, such that if an intruder came in, no matter where she was, she would have a loaded handgun within arm's reach. And I think in some ways that exemplifies the sort of person that she was, which is very independent, fiercely loyal, but was not afraid to take extreme measures to protect her family, even unnecessarily paranoid maybe measures to protect her family. But she was very loving. It wasn't just F words and handguns. Mamaw really cared and tried to understand, tried to understand what made us tick. I don't know how PG I have to be at this forum.
So it's okay.
It's okay.
This is New York.
Well, no, this is, sort of an awkward story, but I didn't put it in the book. I don't think I put it in the book. Like the talk that people have with their children about sex and safe sex and however people have it. With Mamaw, it was we were riding, I was taking her to get her hair cut, and she looked over at me and she said, "JD," and I was probably 16 years old. She said, "JD, do you have hair on your pecker?" And I said, "Why?" And she said, "I just need to know, and if you get anybody pregnant, I'll effing kill you." And that was the talk with Mamaw, right? So she took care of business.
She meant it.
Yeah, exactly. And she took care of business, but she also, you've written a fair amount, and I'm sure you've had an editor tell you it's much more important to show than to tell. So Mamaw talked a lot about the importance of education. She talked a lot about how great of an opportunity it was. Mamaw did not have hardly any money. She was a very poor person, and we were very poor when I was living with her. But when I got into a calculus class with a professor who was a teacher in high school who was notoriously hard, she went out and made sure that I had the graphing calculator that he suggested that we have. And that was really important. That showed me that, look, this woman who can't even afford her prescription copays, she can go out and value and prize this education. I should do the same thing, and I should take it pretty seriously. And so, my grades started to get better. I think the stability of her home really, really mattered. That's something you can't really describe, But it's a really powerful thing to go home to the same place every night, to know that the next year you're going to be able to just to go home to the same place, to know that if somebody mails you a letter, it's going to arrive in the place that you're living. You know, little things like that just made me feel like this is where I am. I can focus on the things that teenagers should focus on, which is really, really powerful and important.
So then you have your next, really, again, fairly transformative experience. You join the military.
Sure. Yeah, so I went and enlisted in the Marine Corps in April of 2003, which the historians will remember that we invaded Iraq in March of 2003, late March of 2003. I heard you had something to do with that.
I was there. I was there. I was the one who famously asked a guy who had 2 Pulitzer Prizes, forgetting that we were on the record very early on, tell me how this ends. But please.
So I went and enlisted in the Marine Corps, and partially I enlisted in the Marine Corps just because of the reputation, but really Mamaw had 6 grandchildren, and 3 of the 6 joined the Marine Corps. So 2 of my older cousins had joined the Marines, and it at that point sort of felt like a family tradition. And what motivated me to join the Marines is this sense that you could actually, for lack of a better phrase, you could learn how to be an adult there. That I knew I wanted to go to college, I knew I wanted to get an education, I knew I wanted to access some of these opportunities that Mamaw had guaranteed that I would have, but I also knew I wasn't ready. Things like balancing a checkbook, things like making sure that you pay your rent on time, things like doing your homework when you don't have a crazy woman with 19 handguns busting your balls about doing your homework. Like those things, I just knew, those sort of soft skills I knew that I was a little bit deficient in. It's probably like the one truly wise moment of my childhood was to walk into a recruiter's office and say, hey, I think I'd like to do this. Now, Mamaw was furious when I joined the Marine Corps. I mean, it was absolutely devastated. She told the recruiter when he came by to do a home visit that if he stepped 1 foot on her porch, she would blow it off. And I remember this just incredibly awkward moment where Mamaw's standing there at the edge of the porch with her walker, and the recruiter is just standing in the yard looking up at her, pretty terrified. But the Marine Corps really was this transformative experience. I think the one thing that I thought I really needed, which was some character education, some soft skill education, is what I got in the Marines. The first major purchase I ever made was in the Marine Corps. I went and bought a 2004 Honda Civic from one of those really terrible, off-base car dealers that, folks like you tell young enlisted Marines and soldiers not to make a terrible mistake. Well, I went in there, and they were going to give me an interest rate of 20.9% on this Honda Civic that I was buying.
You'd still be paying for it.
Exactly. And it was a Marine Corps gunnery sergeant who said, this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard of. Go to Navy Federal Credit Union, get a better loan, and then go and buy that car. And so that's what I did. Of course, I learned how to wake up on time, and I had somebody yelling at me if I didn't. I learned how to work in a team. I learned how to give and take constructive feedback. And all of these things really did, like I said, teach me how to be an adult in a modern way. And I don't think that I would have had nearly the same life that I've had if it hadn't been for the United States Marine Corps. And the other thing that the Marines are really incredible about is teaching this sense of possibility, right? You don't make excuses in the Marine Corps. You set a goal and you get there. And if you don't get there, you're going to get your ass chewed, and that you better have a plan for how to get back on the horse and try again. And that willfulness, that sense of possibility, that sense of real optimism about what's possible when you put your mind to it, again, is something that there was a bit of an environmental narrative in my own hometown pushing back against. If there was a sense of helplessness, a sense that I couldn't control my own destiny coming from certain sectors back home, certainly not from Mamaw, the Marine Corps really transformed that and created an environmental narrative that was almost exactly the opposite. Again, this show versus tell thing is interesting because Mamaw could talk all day about what was possible. Mamaw could talk all day about not giving up on yourself and putting your mind to things. But in the Marine Corps, it was just a way of life, and it was really transformative.
So you complete a tour in combat, you go through all of that. you come back, and now you go to Ohio State.
Sure. Yeah, and Ohio State got a great education. I only spent 2 years there because I felt like an old guy when I showed up on campus. I was 23 years old. I had just spent 4 years in the Marine Corps. I had this introduction to international relations course where there was this 19-year-old. I'll never forget this guy. 19-year-old. Bearded guy, one of those really choppy beards that 19-year-olds seem to think is fashionable in style, but it looked awful. And he said something about how in Iraq, U.S. troops were just committing war crimes all the time, and they didn't care about the local populace, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I was just like, get out of here. You have no idea what's going on. You have no idea what people are actually doing on the ground over there. And I had this moment of thinking, I don't think that I want to spend the next 4 years of my life in class with, half-bearded Joe over here. I think that I really want to get on to the next thing. Now, in hindsight, I think that was probably a little bit short-sighted. I think that I should have taken a little bit more time. Yep. I should have enjoyed the time that I had there because I did love it. I mean, I really enjoyed being at Ohio State. I loved the football games. I loved the professors. I loved the classes. And I found a nice niche of friends from back home who I'd grown up around who were either still in class because they were taking too long to graduate or because they were just a little bit younger than I had been, but they had gone to Middletown High School. And so I really had this fantastic social and educational scene there, but really had this desire to get on to the next thing. And so I graduated after a couple of years, and then I went to law school.
So what was it like did you even think to apply to Yale Law School? I mean, what led you to, that's a fairly audacious.
Yeah, so.
Not that Ohio State's not a great school, and it is, but still and you only spent 2 years there and so forth.
Sure.
And all of a sudden now you're going to, why not climb Mount Everest as our.
Well, the first round of applications, I didn't actually. And so I applied to a few schools. I wasn't very strategic about which schools to apply to. I didn't really appreciate that there was a big difference between going to this law school or that law school. Again, I just hadn't really been acculturated into that way of thinking. And what was pretty helpful was that a buddy of mine who had gone to a nice law school, George Washington Law School, granted, he graduated at the very peak of the economic downturn. So I think my buddy Daryl graduated in 2010. And so even graduates of a place like GW were struggling to find good work. And of course, the debt load at some of these schools is pretty outrageous. And Daryl told me that he had went out to a firm event and ate lunch at a local restaurant, and one of his classmates was actually bussing tables, like a fellow graduate of his law school. And I think the sort of postscript to that is that she ended up finding a good job once the economy picked back up. But at that moment, I thought to myself, okay, this is an insurance policy to go to the very best school that I can get into. And so then I applied to Yale, and I eventually got in, probably because the admissions officers were drunk when they looked at my application.
But you made it through there?
Yeah.
Did great? Met your wife there?
Yeah, met my wife there. I think, Amy Chua is somewhere in the audience today. She was pretty...
Tiger Mom, by the way, she's going to be on stage here next spring. Come on back, Amy, right after this.
That's right.
Anyway, do come back. They showed up with a bottle of wine after all.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, and I think some bourbon I saw back there. So,
For Tom Kaplan.
Yeah, that's right. So I was very lucky in that I felt like there were a few people who collected me. And they, either because they were just good people or they recognized that I was lost, whatever the cause is, there were a few people who sort of said, all right, we're going to show you the ropes here. We're going to make sure you don't do anything really stupid. We're going to tell you the jobs that are out there and why you should or should not apply to them. One of them was Amy, and one of them was this friend of mine who I eventually decided that I was madly in love with. And luckily, when I told her, she said, okay, I'll go out with you. And that woman eventually became my wife. But there were a few people like that, peers, professors, folks who really took me under their wing. And I think it goes to illustrate something that I talk about in the book, this concept of social capital, that it very often in some of these elite circles, it's not what you do, it's not how smart you are, it really is who you know. It's about whether you pass the social test. And that was really, learning that was really transformative for me. And of course, I was lucky enough to have some people who made sure I closed that social capital gap. But
Did you ever feel just sort of out of place, though? Did you ever?
oh, absolutely. I mean, I feel out of place, right here among the elites of Manhattan. No, I felt really out of place, and that was what was so weird. Ohio State was, again, great. I got a great education. It's a great university. I didn't feel out of place at Ohio State. I felt like a complete alien at Yale Law School. It was everything from the way that I talked, which, I've been told that I've lost what little accent I still had when I showed up there, sort of beaten out of me by the Ivy League elites of New Haven, Connecticut. But no, I really, by the time that I was sort of midway through my first year, I really was looking around and wondering, what the hell am I doing here? Like, I don't know what's going on. I don't really know. People are already talking about what jobs they're going to apply to. I don't even know what they're doing. There were friends of mine who didn't want to go work they didn't want to go work at a law firm, or they didn't want to go work for a judge. They were talking about applying to private equity firms. It's like, okay, well, what's a private equity firm do? Well,
highest calling in life, actually.
Well,
but
exactly.
Go ahead.
Well, private equity, you work in finance, and I think to myself, finance, that's like a person who works at a local bank, right? That's like a bank teller or a loan officer. Like, the idea that there were people who worked in these jobs, I didn't even know these jobs existed. And yeah, I mean, more important than that were this sort of subtle social cues. I talk about this in the book, where I go to this law firm dinner and everybody's sitting around and they're drinking wine and they're laughing and socializing. I'm just looking around thinking to myself, oh my God, look at this place. The waiters and waitresses are dressed up, the linens feel like bedcloth. It was just crazy to me. And then this woman comes and asks me if I want some wine, and they have multiple types of white wine, which at the time just blew my mind, right? I think when she said, "Do you want Sauvignon Blanc or Chardonnay?" I really thought, this woman's screwing with me. She knows that I don't belong here. She knows I have no idea what that means, and she's playing a prank on me. So, things like that I think really drove home something that has become part of the cultural commentary around the book in 2016 and the election, which is that there really are these two different worlds. And I'm sure that there are more than two, but in the Marine Corps, at Ohio State, I've never felt in my life like I didn't belong, like I was a cultural outsider. But I did at Yale, and I think there's something to learn from that.
A lot to learn from it, actually. And you've captured so much of that beautifully. Let's go to some of the questions here, because there are really some great ones. I love the one here. What can the Democrats do to win the support of the people in Appalachia?
Well, it's not going to be a satisfactory answer, but move there. I think, going back to this point about
flying over from New York to LA is not adequate?
That doesn't count. That doesn't count. No, I think that so much of this cultural disconnect that exists in the country is built around geography and the places that people live. And this friend of mine, who's a very progressive journalist named Alec McGillis, he wrote this story for the New York Times maybe a year ago, and I think the headline was "Move or Go Midwest, Young Hipster." And his basic argument was, you can't expect people to vote for you when you literally are never in their places, you're not spending any time among them and living with them. And I think that's the fundamental problem that the Democrats have. I mean, I think the Republicans have it in the opposite direction. But I think the problem with the Democrats is that they're so concentrated among coastal enclaves, typically among pretty economic, well-to-do areas, that they're really culturally disconnected from some of the people that I write about. And that's not a problem I think you can solve with a better policy agenda or better political rhetoric. I don't think people are going to vote for strangers.
Do you believe the U.S. should protect the coal and steel industries?
I think smarter and better informed people to ask about this. But no, I mean, I think that this story of the American economy has been one where some industries go away and then some industries arise to take their place. It's been this constant disruption and innovation cycle. 200 years ago, over 90% of us worked on farms. I think today about 2% of people work on farms. So I don't think that we should be trying to just protect industries for the sake of protecting them. I do think that we should be thinking, and this is what I work with Steve Case on, thinking about regional entrepreneurship and regional economic growth. I don't think that if the decision that people have, or the choice that we're offering them is, if you can't find a job in West Virginia, go move to New York or San Francisco, a lot of people are going to say, I'm going to stay home even though the economic opportunities aren't as great. And so I do think that we need to be thinking a lot more constructively, not necessarily about how we protect the coal industry, but how do we bring the modern economy to some of these areas? How do we bring more economic growth? How do we bring more economic investment? And unless you do that, you're going to continue to have, again, this pretty significant cultural disconnect, because everybody's not going to move to San Francisco. Part of the reason they're going to move to San Francisco is because a two-bedroom apartment costs about $4,500 on average in the Bay Area. But a lot of the reason they're not going to move is because they just don't want to move that far away from their homes. And so I don't think it's a viable way to have an American economy to say that we're only going to have a few economic powerhouses. That's not the way that things have really worked, and I don't think that's the way that things should work in the future.
What impact do you believe your book had on the election of 2016? Thank you for these questions, by the way. See, they're proving my...
You were right. You were right about the crowd here. I don't think that it had any effect on the outcome, because, let's be honest, the proportion of the country that's read Hillbilly Elegy, it's certainly higher than most books, but I still think most people have no idea who I am. Most people aren't really familiar with the arguments that I make in Hillbilly Elegy, so I don't think it had a major effect on the actual outcome. I do think that it maybe had an effect on the narrative of how we interpret the results in the election. I think that the question, how do Democrats appeal to the white working class? How do they appeal to the folks in Appalachia? I do think that's a question that is in some ways influenced by the book and some of the commentary that's come in response to it. I'm actually happy about that. There are a lot of things about the book that I'm unhappy about, in the sense that people say that it's this huge insight into Donald Trump and why he won in 2016, which of course Donald Trump is never mentioned in the book. I don't think Hillary Clinton is ever mentioned in the book either. So the way that it's been given a political salience has never quite sat well with me. But I'm actually okay with the way that folks have tried to ask themselves, how can we break down some of these barriers, whether they're culturally meaningful or politically meaningful? And I'm glad that the book has had that effect. Mr. Vance, what are your plans to run for public office in the future? So the politician's answer is that I'm not currently thinking about running for office, but never say never. So I'm not currently thinking about running for office, but never say never. Fair enough. JD, how has success with your book changed you? Oh, that's an interesting question. I hope that it hasn't changed me a whole lot. I mean, I think it's probably doesn't reflect super well on me if my success is in the past year and a half has radically altered the sort of person that I am. I think that I'm a lot more impatient about airports. I hate flying, and I always used to think flying was fun and traveling was cool, and now I hate going to airports. So it's changed me in that way. I mean, I'm probably a little bit more guarded, right? And I think that if I had known, again, that 2 million people would have read the book, I probably would have written a different book, because this is really open and it really is really honest, and in some ways painfully so. So I think that I'm probably a little bit more guarded. I'm a little bit more aware of the fact that if I say something that's a little bit off or a little bit imperfect, people might judge me or have some negative reaction to it. So that's probably changed me. I mean, I hope that I haven't lost anything. I hope that I still am connected to my community, and I hope that I'm not sort of an arrogant person who just wrote a #1 New York Times best-selling book. I sort of hope that I haven't gotten too big for my britches, as folks say back home. But I'm probably the worst person. I'm the most biased person to ask that question to. So you have to ask my family and friends from back home. Why'd you move back to Ohio? Because I want to run for political office. No, I'm kidding. Well, a couple of reasons, right? So the original impetus for moving back is that I knew that I wanted to sort of work on some of the problems that I write about in the book.
Which is why I wanted to bring him on the stage, by the way, because that's where we're going to
Sure.
go eventually.
And I think that, the opioid crisis especially is something that has had a big effect on my family and that is very close to my heart. And it sort of struck me as a little bit weird to go around the country talking about the opioid crisis, but then to go back to my venture capital firm in San Francisco and not actually do anything about it. And so I started a nonprofit organization that is really geared towards helping not so much those who are addicted, not because I don't think they need help, but because I've decided to focus on something else, but on what I call the collateral damage of the addiction epidemic. So the folks who've lost their families, the grandparents who are taking care of 2 or 3 young kids that they didn't anticipate taking care of. We're trying to figure out how to make life a little bit easier for those people, both from a policy perspective and also from just a direct resource contribution perspective. So that was the original impetus. The second thing, we talk about this sort of political office thing, and people, when I moved back, I just got this question constantly: Are you going to run for office? Are you going to run for office? And the answer has always been, like I said, no. I don't have any real desire to do it, at least not now. What I am excited about is this thing I'm working on with Steve Case, the Rise of the Rest Initiative, because part of the problem in our country, as far as I can tell, is a lot of the really exciting next generation 21st century companies, the high growth, high job creating entrepreneurial startups. They are too concentrated in places like San Francisco and Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I think that if you can flip that script a little bit, if you can show that there are both exciting entrepreneurs, but also access to investment capital in these areas, then you can start to close some of the gaps that I write about in the book, where, okay, maybe you're not going to be able to stay in your home in rural Eastern Kentucky, but maybe you only have to move 30 minutes away to Lexington, Kentucky, or maybe you only have to move 3.5 hours away to Cincinnati, maybe an hour and a half away to Charleston, West Virginia. I do think that figuring out a way to create a regional economy that's a little bit more vibrant than what you see right now is a really big piece to trying to unpack some of the issues that I wrote about in Hillbilly Elegy. So working on those two things is what made me want to move back, because it's hard to focus on regional entrepreneurship when you're in Silicon Valley, and it's certainly hard to focus on the opioid crisis in Ohio when you're in Silicon Valley.
What life lessons did you learn? Yeah.
Thank you.
Ken, honestly, it's actually the real reason I wanted to get him here. It's a great book, but what's as interesting is, okay, so what do you do about all this stuff?
Sure.
And so here's one. What life lessons did you learn on your journey that you'd like to pass on to your child? As you have your child is how old?
4 months.
4 months. By the way, his wife is not an underachiever either. She's clerking for the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, very, very proud of her. What life lessons I took away, I live in a world, most of the time at least, going around talking about the book, spending time among folks in private equity and law firms and the titans of industry and government and so forth. And I think it's a world that is really obsessed, and I would say overly obsessed, with elite credentials. People are really into the educational degree that's on their resume. They're really into comparing the prestige of different jobs. And, obviously that's partially a consequence of just really ambitious people, and I don't think ambition is a bad thing. But I hope that I can teach my kid that there are other much more important things in the world. That though Mamaw Bonnie wasn't a Yale Law School graduate, and though she never had very much money, there was something really good and really honorable and really worthy about the life that she lived. And I am terrified that given where my kid is going to grow up, that he won't learn that lesson. So I really, that's what I hope that he gains. I hope that when he looks at somebody like Mamaw Bonnie, unfortunately, of course, he won't ever spend any time with her himself, that he looks at that person not as an object of pity and not as a person that he looks down his nose at, but that he says, this is a person whose life is actually really interesting and fascinating and worthy of attention and respect. And I think that's going to take a lot of work, but to me, that's how I try to prevent that cultural divide from becoming too big.
The president won quite a few states by appealing to those about which you write in your book.
Sure.
I made a lot of promises to them along the way. How do you assess that he's doing for that particular constituency?
Oh, God.
I made that up. That's my question, by the way.
Yeah, I would.
I should have attributed
I
it.
would. Yeah, I'd love it if we were out of time and I didn't have to answer that one. You know, so one is obviously it's early. We're 9 months into a 4-year term, but I think that at this point, am I excited about what the Republicans? I mean, look, I'm a Republican. I've been a Republican basically since I cared about politics. We have the Congress, we have the Senate, we have the presidency, and I can't honestly look people back home in the eye and say that we've done much of anything, and that really, really bothers me. And I think that I will say this. I, of course, during the campaign was pretty critical of the president for this very reason, because I thought that he diagnosed and critiqued much of what was wrong with mainstream American politics, but there wasn't an agenda that really went along with it. And I really worried that agenda, the sort of positive, what do we do next, would fundamentally get lost in the sauce. I continue to worry about that. But I will say that my takeaway of the past 9 months is that my party has a lot of work to do, and it's not just about the President of the United States. I think that Republicans have got to wake up to the fact that whether they like it or not, non-college educated voters are a bigger and bigger part of their constituency, and we've got to do something for those folks. We've got to actually continue to give them a reason to vote for us, not just because people want to win elections, but because I happen to think that it's the right thing to do. And I still don't think the party has quite reckoned with the fact that the party of the George H.W. Bush Country Club Republican is just not the same party today. And that's not just a problem with the president. I think that's a problem that goes up and down some of the institutions of the party. And that's something I try to work on every day too, is to convince my side of the aisle that, look, we're living in a different world. We're living in a different we're living in a place with a different set of challenges, and most importantly, we're living with a different electorate, and we've got to actually adjust our thinking, policy and political, to adjust for that fact.
Final question. You've identified these extraordinary issues: working class whites, erosion of the work ethic, chaotic family circumstances, collapse of religious observance, not prepared at all for the evolving economy that lies ahead. You're now looking at how do you address these, plus the opioid and the other disintegration of families and so forth. What are the early, I guess it's too early to say lessons, but what are the early initiatives? What are the big ideas, I guess, that are starting to emerge for you?
So the positive way forward, or at least the thinking about how you would develop that positive way forward that makes me the most optimistic, is that folks are starting to recognize that there's a difference between economic opportunity and a group of people who are able to take care of that, or take advantage of that economic opportunity, right? So I talked about what I'm doing with Steve Case earlier. A big part of the equation is how do we get more high-quality jobs into some of these parts of the country? I think that's important, but bracket that for a second. What's really, really important and hasn't gotten enough attention, but a few folks are starting to give it the right amount of attention, is how do we take somebody who has never spent any time in a modern tech economy, whose skills are almost entirely built around an industry that's hemorrhaging jobs, and importantly, has been out of the labor force for 10 years, and how do we re-engage those folks? It's not just a question of giving them a new technical degree and a new job opportunity. I've spent some time with some folks who are working on this in Baltimore, and they talk about hiring folks for modern construction jobs. Not traditional high-skilled, require a 4 or 6 year degree, but very skilled and very well-paying jobs in their own right. And what they find is that the people who've been out of the labor force for 10 years, they come onto these construction jobs. The first time a manager criticizes them, they fly off the handle because they don't have the emotional IQ, they don't have the sort of self-regulation necessary to exist in a workplace. They often have mental health issues. They've got transportation issues. They've got addiction issues. They've got family problems back home with a chaotic spouse or a chaotic kid. And I think that we're only now starting to scratch the surface of how do we deal with that person. Not a person who doesn't have access to a good job or doesn't have access to the training, but a person who has access to those things but is so withdrawn from institutions of work and family that re-engaging them is not just about creating new economic growth, it's about fundamentally rethinking how we re-engineer and re-engage folks. Have I seen a silver bullet yet? Absolutely not. But I have at least seen people start to appreciate that that's the challenge. That the challenge we like to talk about, and I think we're very comfortable talking about politically, is let's create better jobs. Let's give better funding to our public schools. Let's do the things that we've been hearing about for 20 or 30 years, and not enough appreciation for you can fund a public school as much as possible. But if that kid goes home and spends 8 hours of their life in a domestic war zone, there is nothing you're going to be able to do to undo the trauma of that home. That if a guy has been out of the labor force for 10 years, his skills have atrophied, and he's completely lost his ability to engage constructively with criticism and emotional stress at work, you're not going to be able to fix his problem if you just give the guy a construction job and hope that he does better. That recognition of how deep and complex these problems are gives me some hope that we're starting to get in the direction of a solution. But I haven't seen anything that makes me think we figured it all out. There's still a lot of work to do.
Well, and you're the man to do it. Ladies and gentlemen,
thank you.
J.D. Vance.